Sometimes desperation leads us to choices we never thought we'd make. For David Martinez, watching his 8-year-old daughter fight leukemia while their medical bills piled up, that choice came in the form of a classified ad from billionaire Helena Blackwell. She offered him $2 million to father her child. The deal was simple. He would provide what she needed to have a baby, then walk away forever. But when Helena dies during childbirth, her cold sister Victoria shows up to claim the newborn. She expects David to hand over the baby and disappear. Instead, she finds him holding the son he was never supposed to meet, and he refuses to let go. What happens when a father's love breaks $1 million contract? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David Martinez had always believed that a man's worth was measured by how well he provided for his family. At 34, his calloused hands told the story of 15 years in construction, building homes for other people's dreams, while struggling to maintain his own small corner of the world. The 2-bedroom apartment on Maple Street wasn't much to look at: faded carpet, a kitchen table that wobbled despite his repeated attempts to fix it, and windows that needed replacing before another winter, but it was home. More importantly, it was where his daughter Emma felt safe. The medication chart taped to the refrigerator had become the center of their universe. Color-coded and laminated, it tracked Emma's complex treatment schedule with military precision: morning pills at 7, afternoon injection at 2, evening medication at 6, and the dreaded weekly hospital visits that left them both emotionally drained. David had memorized every detail, every possible side effect, every hopeful statistic that Dr. Peterson shared during their appointments. Emma sat at the kitchen table now, her thin frame dwarfed by one of his old flannel shirts that she insisted on wearing because it smelled like sawdust and safety. Her once thick brown hair had grown back in patches after the initial round of chemotherapy, creating a soft fuzz that caught the morning light streaming through their east-facing window. She was working on her homework with the determined concentration that had carried her through the worst days of her diagnosis 6 months ago. "Dad, what's 7 times 8? She asked without looking up from her math worksheet. "What do you think it is, kiddo?" David replied from the stove, where he was scrambling eggs with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to cook out of necessity rather than passion. Emma chewed on her pencil eraser, a habit that had emerged since she'd gotten sick. 56. That's my smart girl." He plated her eggs alongside a piece of buttered toast, cut diagonally the way she preferred. "Eat up. We've got Dr. Peterson at 10. And you know how grumpy you get when you're hungry during the blood draws." The routine was their lifeline. Every morning began the same way: breakfast together, medication administered with chocolate milk to mask the bitter taste, and careful attention to how Emma was feeling. David had become an expert at reading the subtle signs: the way she moved more slowly when her joints ached, how she grew quiet when nausea was setting in, the forced brightness in her voice when she was trying to protect him from her pain. Their small living room bore witness to their journey together. Medical textbooks borrowed from the library sat stacked beside Emma's art supplies. Get-well cards from her second-grade classmates covered one entire wall, their crayon drawings of rainbows and flowers creating a splash of color against the beige paint. David's toolbox sat in the corner, always ready for the small repairs that kept their world functioning, though lately he'd been too exhausted to tackle anything beyond the absolute necessities. The financial reality of Emma's illness had crept up on them like fog rolling in from the ocean. David's construction job provided decent wages and basic health insurance, but pediatric oncology existed in a different economic universe. The insurance covered the standard treatments, but Dr. Peterson had mentioned experimental therapies available in Europe, treatments that could potentially save Emma's life, but cost more than David would earn in 5 years. Late at night, after Emma had fallen asleep, David would sit at his laptop, researching clinical trials and treatment centers. He'd filled 3 notebooks with information about immunotherapy, experimental drugs, and success rates. The numbers were encouraging, but they all came with price tags that might as well have been written in a foreign language. $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 for the most promising treatment in Switzerland. He'd applied for medical loans, started a crowdfunding page that had raised barely $3,000, and even swallowed his pride enough to ask his foreman about picking up weekend shifts. Every avenue led to the same conclusion. There wasn't enough time to earn what Emma needed, and there weren't enough miracles to go around. That's when Helena Blackwell's classified ad appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he'd been afraid to voice. The ad itself was deceptively simple, buried in the back pages of the local paper between offers for handyman services and estate sales. Seeking biological father for planned pregnancy. Compensation, $200,000. Discretion required. Serious inquiries only. A phone number followed. Nothing more. David had stared at those words for 20 minutes before Emma's voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad, you okay?" She was standing in the doorway to his bedroom, her small frame silhouetted by the hallway light. "Just reading, sweetheart. Go back to bed." But sleep hadn't come easily that night. $2 million. The number represented everything Emma needed, and more: the experimental treatments, the best doctors, travel to Switzerland if necessary, and enough left over to secure her future, regardless of what happened to him. It also represented a choice that went against every principle he'd tried to live by. 3 days passed before he made the call. The voice that answered was crisp, professional, belonging to someone who clearly handled unusual requests as part of their daily routine. "Blackwell Legal Services. How may I direct your call?" "I'm calling about the classified ad. The one about—" "One moment, please." The hold music was classical, something he might have heard in a museum or fancy restaurant. When the line clicked back to life, a different voice spoke, older, more measured. "This is Attorney James Morrison. Thank you for your interest. Before we proceed, I need to establish a few things. Are you calling on your own behalf?" "Yes." "Are you currently married or in a committed relationship?" "No. I'm a single father." "Children?" "One daughter. She's 8. Health issues, either yourself or your child." David hesitated. "My daughter has leukemia." A pause. "I see. Mr. Martinez." "David Martinez." "Mr. Martinez, my client is very specific about her requirements. This arrangement involves artificial insemination through a medical facility. There would be no physical contact between you and my client. No involvement in the pregnancy. No parental rights or responsibilities after the birth. The compensation would be paid in installments tied to specific milestones. Are you prepared to discuss this arrangement in detail?" The law office occupied the top floor of the tallest building in downtown, with windows that offered a view of the entire city spread out below like a patchwork quilt. David had never been in a space so polished, so removed from the world where he spent his days. The conference table was larger than his living room, and the leather chairs probably cost more than his monthly rent. Helena Blackwell entered the room like winter itself, elegant, untouchable, and somehow lonely, despite her obvious wealth. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back severely, and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything without revealing anything in return. Her handshake was firm but brief, and she took the seat across from him with the careful precision of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of her environment. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice carrying the trace of an accent he couldn't identify. "Thank you for coming. James has explained the basic terms?" "He has." "Good. I believe in directness, so let me be clear about my expectations. I want a child, and I want that child to have the best possible genetic foundation. Your background check revealed excellent health, strong family history, and forgive the clinical nature of this desirable physical characteristics." David felt heat rise in his cheeks, but Helena continued without pause. I'm 39 years old. I've experienced multiple pregnancy losses, and my doctors believe this may be my final opportunity for a successful pregnancy. I cannot afford emotional complications or legal challenges after the birth. The contract you'll sign today ensures that you'll have no claim to this child, no knowledge of the pregnancy's progress, and no contact with me or the child after today. She slid a thick document across the table. The first payment of $500,000 will be transferred to your account once the pregnancy is confirmed. Subsequent payments are tied to the second trimester, third trimester, and successful live birth. The final payment brings your total compensation to $2 million. David stared at the contract, the legal language swimming before his eyes. And if something goes wrong, if the pregnancy doesn't, you keep whatever has been paid to that point. The risk is entirely mine. Why me? He asked. Helena's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Because you're trying to save your daughter's life, and I respect that kind of love. Because you're not doing this from greed, but from desperation, which makes you trustworthy. And because, she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, because I believe that children born from such deep motivation are blessed with something special. The signing took less than 10 minutes. David's signature felt heavier than any contract he'd ever signed, carrying the weight of Emma's future and his own moral uncertainty. Helena shook his hand once more, wished him well with his daughter's treatment, and disappeared behind a door marked "Private" without looking back. The first payment arrived in his account within 24 hours, appearing as the electronic transfer that transformed his empty checking account into something that could actually save Emma's life. That night, he held his sleeping daughter a little longer than usual, whispering promises about Switzerland and miracle treatments and all the tomorrows they were going to share together. He never imagined that less than 8 months later, he'd be holding a different child, one who carried his DNA and Helena's desperate dreams while facing a woman who looked at him as if he were stealing her birthright. The call came at 3:17 in the morning, piercing through David's sleep like a blade. He'd been dreaming about Emma's laughter, the sound she made when she was truly happy, not the careful, protective joy she'd learned to display during her illness, but the unreserved delight of a healthy 8-year-old discovering something wonderful. The harsh buzz of his phone shattered that precious moment, dragging him back to a reality where such calls could only mean one thing. Mr. Martinez. The voice was professional but strained, belonging to someone who delivered difficult news as part of their job. This is Dr. Sarah Chen from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling regarding Helena Blackwell. David sat up so quickly that his head spun. According to their contract, he shouldn't be receiving this call. Helena's pregnancy was supposed to remain completely separate from his life, a clinical transaction that began and ended with his signature on legal documents. Is everything what's wrong? Ms. Blackwell experienced sudden cardiac arrest approximately 2 hours ago. We performed an emergency cesarean section to deliver the baby. The infant is stable, but Ms. Blackwell, Dr. Chen's pause carried the weight of practiced compassion. I'm sorry, Mr. Martinez. We weren't able to save her. The words hit him like a physical blow. Helena Blackwell, the woman who had sat across from him in that gleaming conference room with such controlled determination, was gone. Dead at 39, just moments after achieving the thing she'd wanted most in the world. The baby. A healthy boy, born at 39 weeks and 2 days, 5 pounds, 8 ounces. He's in the NICU as a precaution, but his vital signs are strong. Dr. Chen hesitated. Mr. Martinez, we found your contact information in Ms. Blackwell's emergency files. Her attorney is en route, but well, the situation is complicated. Would you be able to come to the hospital? David looked at the clock, calculating. Emma was sleeping peacefully in the next room, and Mrs. Rodriguez next door had watched her before during emergencies. I'll be there within the hour. The drive to St. Mary's passed in a blur of empty streets and racing thoughts. David had signed away all parental rights, had taken Helena's money with the understanding that he would never see this child, never be part of its life. Yet here he was, speeding toward a hospital where a baby, his baby, genetically speaking, lay motherless in a sterile room, breathing his first breaths, without the woman who had moved heaven and earth to bring him into existence. St. Mary's at 4 in the morning was a different world from the bustling medical center David knew from Emma's treatments. The hallways echoed with the soft sounds of overnight care, muted conversations at nursing stations, the distant hum of machinery, the occasional chime of elevator bells. Dr. Chen met him at the main desk, a slight woman with kind eyes who looked as if she'd been running on coffee and determination for too many hours. "Thank you for coming," she said, shaking his hand. "I know this isn't what anyone expected." She led him through a maze of corridors to the NICU, where a large window looked into a room filled with tiny beds and sophisticated equipment. "He's the third isolate from the left," Dr. Chen said softly. "We've been calling him Baby Blackwell for now." David's first sight of his son stole his breath completely. The infant was smaller than he'd expected but perfectly formed, with a dusting of dark hair and skin that held the faintest trace of David's olive complexion. Tiny fingers curled around, nothing, and even through the glass, David could see the steady rise and fall of the baby's chest. This child existed because of a choice David had made in desperation, yet looking at him now, the transaction felt transformed into something approaching miracle. "Can I?" David's voice cracked. "Can I hold him?" Dr. Chen studied his face carefully. "The legal situation is complex. Ms. Blackwell's next of kin has been contacted, but until the attorneys sort everything out, yes, I think that would be appropriate. You are, after all, his biological father." The process of entering the NICU involved scrubbing his hands and arms until they were raw, donning a sterile gown, and moving with the careful quietness that such places demanded. When the nurse finally placed the baby in his arms, David felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. This wasn't the abstract concept he'd signed papers for. This was a living, breathing person who shared his DNA, his stubborn chin, and possibly his tendency toward thick, unruly hair. "Hello, little one," David whispered, settling into the rocking chair beside the isolette. "I'm well. I'm not sure what I am to you exactly, but I'm here." The baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing the unfocused blue that all newborns carried. For a moment, father and son regarded each other in the soft light of the NICU, two people connected by genetics and circumstance, meeting for what was supposed to be the first and last time. David had been sitting there for nearly an hour when he heard the sharp click of expensive heels on polished floor. Through the glass window, he could see a woman approaching, tall, severe, dressed in a business suit despite the early hour. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and she moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to having obstacles removed from her path. "That must be Victoria Blackwell," Dr. Chen murmured, appearing at David's elbow. "Helena's sister and heir." Victoria Blackwell entered the NICU like a force of nature, her eyes immediately finding David and the baby with laser precision. She was younger than Helena had been, perhaps 35, but carried herself with the same untouchable elegance that seemed to be a family trademark. Where Helena had possessed a quiet desperation beneath her controlled exterior, Victoria radiated pure authority. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to convey displeasure without disturbing the other infants in the room. "I believe you're holding my nephew." David looked up from the baby's sleeping face. "You must be Victoria. I'm David Martinez." "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Martinez." Victoria's gaze was cool, assessing. "What I don't understand is why you're here. The contract was quite specific about your role ending with conception." "Your sister died," David said quietly, tightening his hold on the baby protectively. "The hospital called me. An administrative error, I'm sure. One that will be corrected immediately." Victoria turned to Dr. Chen. "Doctor, I'll need to speak with whoever made the decision to involve Mr. Martinez in this situation. As Helena's next of kin and the child's legal guardian, I should have been the only person contacted." Dr. Chen maintained her professional calm, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. Ms. Blackwell, the situation was unprecedented. Your sister's emergency contacts included Mr. Martinez, and given his biological relationship to the child. A relationship he voluntarily terminated through legal contract, Victoria interrupted. Mr. Martinez, I'm sure you understand that this is an emotionally difficult time for our family. I'll need you to hand over the baby so we can begin making proper arrangements. David felt the baby's small body against his chest, warm and trusting. Proper arrangements, childcare, of course. Helena's estate will require time to sort through, and I have a company to run. I'll need to interview nannies, establish care protocols, ensure the child's needs are met. Victoria spoke as if she were organizing a corporate restructuring rather than planning for a newborn's life. You're talking about him like he's a business problem to solve. Victoria's expression hardened. He's Helena's son, which makes him my responsibility. A responsibility I take seriously, despite having no experience with children. She extended her arms expectantly. Now, if you would please. No. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. David hadn't planned to say it, hadn't consciously made the decision to refuse, but holding this child, his child, made the idea of simply handing him over to a stranger feel impossible. Excuse me? Victoria's voice dropped to a dangerous level. I said no. David stood carefully, keeping the baby secure against his shoulder. He's not a package to be transferred. He's a person. Helena's son, yes, but also mine. You have no legal standing here, Mr. Martinez. The contract was with Helena. Helena's dead. David's voice carried a firmness that surprised even him. This changes everything. Victoria stepped closer, and David caught a hint of expensive perfume mixed with the coffee she'd probably been drinking through the night. Are you suggesting you intend to break a legally binding agreement? Because I should warn you, Helena's estate has considerable resources to enforce that contract. I'm suggesting that maybe we need to figure out what's best for him, not what's most convenient for either of us. For the first time since entering the room, Victoria seemed momentarily off balance. She looked at David holding the baby, at Dr. Chen watching the exchange with obvious concern, at the other tiny patients sleeping in their isolates despite the tension crackling around them. Dr. Chen, Victoria said finally, how long before the baby can be discharged? Assuming continued progress, perhaps 3 to 5 days. We want to monitor his feeding and weight gain, ensure there are no complications from the emergency delivery. Victoria nodded curtly. Fine. Mr. Martinez, you have until discharge to come to terms with reality. This child belongs with Helena's family, not with a stranger who happened to contribute genetic material. I suggest you use that time to consult with an attorney about the consequences of violating your contract. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. And Mr. Martinez, don't mistake desperation for parental instinct. You needed money to save your daughter. Helena needed a child to fill an empty life. Now, you both have what you wanted. Don't complicate it with sentiment. After Victoria left, the NICU felt simultaneously more peaceful and more fragile. David settled back into the rocking chair, studying the baby's face for signs of the woman who had brought him into existence, and the stranger who now claimed him. What do you think, little guy? He whispered. Think your Aunt Victoria's going to figure out that love isn't something you can schedule or delegate? The baby slept on, oblivious to the legal and emotional storm swirling around his tiny existence, while David held him close and wondered how a simple business transaction had become the most complicated decision of his life. Victoria Blackwell had built her reputation on solving problems efficiently and without emotion. As the CEO of Blackwell Industries, she'd navigated hostile takeovers, labor disputes, and board rebellions with the same cool precision that had earned her a corner office on the 42nd floor and a reputation for being brilliant but ruthless. Yet standing in the hospital parking garage at dawn, she found herself completely unprepared for the problem of David Martinez. The man was supposed to have been a simple transaction, a means to an end that Helena had orchestrated with typical thoroughness. According to the extensive background check Victoria had now reviewed 3 times, David Martinez was exactly what Helena had wanted: healthy, intelligent, financially motivated, and desperate enough to walk away cleanly. Instead, Victoria had found him in the NICU, looking at Helena's baby, as if the child was the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life. She sat in her BMW, engine running but going nowhere, and pulled out the diary that the surrogate mother had left behind. Janet Morrison had carried Helena's baby for 9 months, documenting the experience in a leather-bound journal that Helena's attorney had discovered among the woman's personal effects at the hospital. Victoria had initially planned to dispose of it. Unread, the emotional complications of pregnancy were exactly the kind of messiness she preferred to avoid. But something about David's protective stance over the baby had made her curious about the human elements she'd been trained to ignore. The diary revealed a side of Helena that Victoria had forgotten existed. Janet Morrison wrote about her conversations with Helena during doctor visits, noting how the usually controlled woman would soften when discussing the baby's development. "She asked me today if I could feel him moving," one entry read. "When I took her hand and placed it on my stomach, she actually cried. I've never seen someone so desperate to connect with their unborn child." Victoria closed the diary and stared through her windshield at the hospital building where her nephew lay sleeping. When had Helena become so lonely that she'd resorted to buying a baby from a stranger? More importantly, when had Victoria become so absorbed in corporate success that she'd failed to notice her sister's pain? The Blackwell family had never been warm. Their parents had died when Victoria was 22 and Helena was 19, leaving behind a manufacturing empire and 2 daughters who'd learned to value achievement over affection. Victoria had thrown herself into business school and corporate climbing, while Helena had pursued advanced degrees in art history and traveled extensively, always searching for something she could never quite name. Their relationship had devolved into obligatory holiday dinners and brief phone calls, 2 women who shared genetics and little else. Now Helena was gone, and Victoria was responsible for a child she'd never wanted, and a man who clearly had no intention of honoring his contract. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant. "Board meeting moved to 10 a.m. Patterson Industries response needed by noon. Goldman wants to discuss merger terms at 2 p.m. Victoria stared at the messages, normally her lifeline to a world that made sense, and felt nothing but exhaustion. How was she supposed to negotiate multi-million-dollar deals when she couldn't even figure out how to handle one stubborn construction worker and a baby who weighed less than her laptop? Back in the NICU, David was discovering that newborns didn't follow convenient schedules. The baby, he'd started thinking of him as Michael, though he had no right to name him, had been awake for the past hour, fussing quietly and refusing the bottle that the nursing staff had provided. David had changed his diaper twice, tried rocking him, singing softly, and even walking the length of the NICU, but nothing seemed to settle the infant's general dissatisfaction with the world. "He's probably picking up on the tension," suggested Nurse Patricia, a woman in her 50s who'd been caring for premature and at-risk babies for over 20 years. "Newborns are more sensitive to emotional atmospheres than people realize." "What kind of tension?" David asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. "The kind that comes from uncertainty about the future. Babies need to feel secure, even when they're too young to understand what security means." Patricia checked Michael's chart, noting his feeding times and diaper changes with practiced efficiency. "You've been here almost constantly since yesterday. Your daughter must be wondering where you are." David felt a stab of guilt. Emma had been staying with Mrs. Rodriguez, their elderly neighbor who'd become something of a surrogate grandmother since Emma's diagnosis. He'd called every few hours to check in, but Emma had grown increasingly quiet during their conversations, a sure sign that she was worried about something she didn't want to burden him with. "She is," he admitted, "but I can't just leave him here alone." "He's not alone. He has excellent medical care, and that's not the same thing." David shifted Michael to his other arm, noting how the baby immediately calmed at the sound of his voice. "He doesn't have anyone who belongs to him." Patricia smiled knowingly. "Except you, apparently. I'm not supposed to belong to him. Legally, I signed away any claim. Honey, I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I can tell you that babies don't care about legal documents. They care about who shows up, who holds them when they're scared, and who makes them feel safe." She gestured toward the window, where Victoria could be seen approaching with a woman who was clearly an attorney based on her briefcase and severe expression. "And right now, you're the one making this little guy feel safe." Victoria entered the NICU, flanked by her legal representation, Margaret Thornfield, senior partner at Thornfield, Williams, Associates, and the woman who'd handled Helena's estate planning. Margaret was in her 60s, with silver hair, and the kind of presence that made opposing counsel reconsider their strategies before speaking. She took one look at David holding the baby and pursed her lips in obvious disapproval. "Ms. Blackwell," Margaret said in a voice that carried clearly across the quiet room, "this situation is more complicated than we initially realized." Victoria kept her distance from David and the baby, as if proximity might somehow contaminate her with unwanted emotion. "How complicated?" "Helena's will contains several unusual provisions that weren't part of the original surrogacy contract. It appears she made some last-minute changes to her estate planning that directly affect the child's custody arrangements." David looked up from Michael's sleeping face. "What kind of provisions?" Margaret opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick document. "Mr. Martinez, while your original contract terminated your parental rights, Helena's will specifically names you as a secondary guardian in the event of her death. It seems she anticipated the possibility that her own demise might leave the child in an uncertain position." "That's impossible," Victoria said. "Helena never mentioned. Your sister was a very private person when it came to her personal affairs." Margaret interrupted. "She updated her will 6 weeks ago, adding provisions that give Mr. Martinez legal standing to contest any custody arrangements he deems unsuitable for the child's welfare." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Helena had planned for this contingency, had deliberately created a legal framework that prevented Victoria from simply taking the baby and disappearing into her corporate world. "She knew," Victoria whispered. "She knew I'd try to handle this like a business transaction." Margaret nodded. Helena was very specific about wanting the child raised with what she called authentic emotional connection. The will includes detailed instructions about the importance of love over convenience, family bonds over financial stability. David stood carefully, still holding Michael against his chest. "What does this mean exactly?" "It means," Margaret said, "that any custody arrangement must take into account your wishes as the child's biological father and secondary guardian. Ms. Blackwell cannot unilaterally make decisions about the baby's care without your input and agreement." Victoria felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She'd come to the hospital expecting to collect her nephew and arrange for his care like any other family responsibility. Instead, she was discovering that Helena had orchestrated one final manipulation, ensuring that Victoria couldn't simply delegate the messy business of child-rearing to hired help. "There's more," Margaret continued. "Helena's estate is substantial, but the funds designated for the child's care are held in trust with specific conditions. The money can only be accessed for the baby's benefit, and both guardians must agree on how it's spent." "Both guardians?" Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. "Helena named you as primary guardian, given your family connection and financial resources, but she named Mr. Martinez as secondary guardian with equal decision-making authority regarding the child's emotional and developmental needs." Margaret closed the file with a decisive snap. Essentially, you'll need to work together. The NICU fell silent, except for the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle whoosh of ventilation systems. David looked at Victoria, seeing her perfect composure finally crack around the edges. This woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar deals was staring at him as if he represented the most insurmountable challenge of her professional life. "Helena planned this," Victoria said, not quite able to hide the admiration in her voice. She knew exactly what she was doing. "Your sister was concerned that you might view the child as an obligation rather than a blessing," Margaret explained gently. She wanted to ensure that he would be raised by people who understood the difference. Michael stirred in David's arms, making the small sounds that newborns make when they're beginning to wake up. David looked down at the baby's face, then at Victoria, who was still processing the reality of her situation. "So what happens now?" David asked. Victoria straightened her shoulders, her business instincts finally kicking in despite the emotional chaos of the morning. "Now we figure out how to raise a child together when we're complete strangers who have absolutely nothing in common." "Except him," David said, gesturing to the baby who was now regarding both adults with the unfocused attention of the very young. "Except him," Victoria agreed, and for the first time since entering the hospital, her voice carried something that might have been hope. The construction site where David had worked for 8 years felt like foreign territory when he returned 3 days later. The familiar sounds, diesel engines, hammering, men calling instructions across scaffolding seemed muted somehow, as if he were hearing them through glass. His crew noticed the change immediately. These were men who'd learned to read each other's moods through years of shared labor, who understood that a distracted worker was a dangerous worker. "Martinez, you look like hell," observed Tony Castellanos, the site foreman who'd given David his first break in construction 15 years earlier. Tony was a compact man with calloused hands and a direct manner that cut through workplace politics like a blade through butter. "Everything okay at home? Emma doing all right?" David secured his hard hat and picked up his tool belt, grateful for the familiar weight of hammer and level against his hip. "Emma's fine. Better than fine, actually. The new treatment is working." He paused, unsure how to explain the rest. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" Tony pulled David aside, away from the other workers who were beginning their morning tasks. "You've been out 3 days without calling. That's not like you." David had rehearsed several versions of this conversation during his drive to the site, but none of them seemed adequate when faced with Tony's direct concern. "How do you explain to a man who's known you for 15 years that you've suddenly become responsible for a newborn baby you were never supposed to meet? Remember that medical situation I mentioned a few months back? The private arrangement that was going to help with Emma's treatment costs?" Tony nodded. "You said it was handled. Everything worked out." "It was handled. But the woman involved, she died in childbirth. And it turns out the baby—" David stopped, realizing how insane it was going to sound. "I'm his biological father, Tony. And his mother's sister wants to raise him like a corporate project while I can't just walk away from him." Tony stared at him for a long moment, processing information that didn't fit into any normal category of workplace problems. "Jesus, David, you're talking about a custody fight with rich people. That's lawyer territory, not construction worker territory." "I know how it sounds. It sounds like you're about to get crushed by people who have more money than God and fewer scruples than politicians." Tony's expression softened slightly. "But it also sounds like you're trying to do right by a kid who needs someone to fight for him." David pulled the construction photo from his wallet, a picture of their crew standing in front of the children's hospital they'd helped build 2 years earlier. 12 men in hard hats and work boots, grinning at the camera, while behind them rose a building designed to heal sick kids. "Remember this project?" "Of course. Best job we ever worked. Knowing we were building something that would help children made every 12-hour day worth it. That's what this feels like, Tony. Like I have a chance to build something that matters. Not a building, but a life. A family, maybe." Tony studied David's face, seeing something there that hadn't been present 3 days ago, a sense of purpose that went beyond paycheck and overtime hours. What do you need? Time, flexibility. The baby's still in the hospital, but when he comes home, you're going to need to be there for him. Tony gestured toward the half-finished office building rising around them. This project runs another 6 months. I can work around doctor appointments and emergencies, but if you're going to be a full-time father to 2 kids, I'll make it work. Maybe. Or maybe you'll run yourself into the ground trying to be everything to everyone. Tony clapped David on the shoulder. Let me talk to the main office, see what kind of family leave options we have. And David, if this gets messy legally, don't try to handle it alone. Rich people fight dirty when they want something. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria was learning that her own workplace offered little refuge from the chaos that had invaded her carefully ordered life. The gleaming corporate offices of Blackwell Industries, with their floor-to-ceiling windows and minimalist design, felt suddenly sterile and unwelcoming. Her assistant, Jennifer, had arranged the morning's meetings with typical efficiency, but Victoria found herself unable to focus on quarterly projections and market analyses. The Patterson Industries presentation is scheduled for 10, Jennifer announced, standing in Victoria's doorway with her tablet and the kind of professional competence that Victoria had always appreciated. Legal needs your approval on the Henderson contract modifications, and the board wants to discuss the European expansion timeline. Victoria nodded absently, staring at the photograph on her desk, a formal portrait of her and Helena taken at some corporate function years ago. They looked like strangers pretending to be sisters, all polished surfaces and practiced smiles. When had they stopped being real with each other? Miss Blackwell? Jennifer's voice carried a note of concern. Should I reschedule anything? You seem distracted. Yes, I know. Victoria forced herself to focus on her assistant's face. Jennifer, what do you know about babies? The question clearly caught Jennifer off guard. She was 28, recently married, and had worked for Victoria for 3 years without ever discussing anything more personal than preferred coffee brands. Babies? As in infant children? As in what they need, how they're cared for, what it takes to... Victoria gestured vaguely, realizing she didn't even know what questions to ask. I've inherited a baby, Jennifer, my sister's child, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm supposed to do with him. Jennifer sat down carefully, recognizing that they'd crossed some invisible line from professional relationship into uncharted territory. Congratulations. I'm sorry for your loss, but a baby is wonderful news, isn't it? Wonderful isn't the word I'd use. Victoria pulled up her internet browser, showing Jennifer the dozens of tabs she'd opened over the past 2 days. I've been researching nannies, pediatricians, childcare facilities, educational programs, everything I can think of to ensure this child has the best possible care. But his biological father, seems to think that love is more important than expertise. His father has concerns about professional childcare. His father wants to be involved, personally involved. He holds the baby like it's the most natural thing in the world, and he refuses to understand that emotional attachment could complicate what should be a straightforward custodial arrangement. Jennifer studied Victoria's face, seeing something there that reminded her of her own sister's expression when she'd been struggling with infertility. Ms. Blackwell, can I ask you something personal? Victoria gestured for her to continue. Do you want this baby? Not as a responsibility or an obligation, but as a child to love and raise. The question hit Victoria like a physical blow. Want was such a simple word, but it carried implications that Victoria had spent her entire adult life avoiding. Wanting things, really wanting them, meant accepting the possibility of loss, disappointment, vulnerability. Her career success had been built on strategic thinking, not emotional desire. I don't know, Victoria admitted. I don't know how to want something like that. Maybe that's where you start, Jennifer suggested gently. Maybe instead of researching the best professional care, you figure out whether you want to provide the care yourself. Victoria's phone rang, interrupting the conversation. The caller ID showed St. Mary's Hospital, and Victoria felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. "Ms. Blackwell, this is Dr. Chen. I wanted to let you know that the baby is ready for discharge tomorrow morning. His weight gain has been excellent, and all his systems are functioning normally." "Tomorrow?" Victoria felt panic rising in her chest. "But we haven't figured out the arrangements yet. Mr. Martinez has been here most of the day. He's quite capable with infant care, and the baby responds very well to him. Perhaps you could discuss the transition plans together." Victoria closed her eyes, imagining David Martinez in the NICU, probably holding Helena's baby with the same protective tenderness she'd witnessed yesterday. "Dr. Chen, in your professional opinion, what do babies need most in their first few weeks of life?" "Consistency, Ms. Blackwell. Routine feeding, diaper changes, safe sleep environments, but most importantly, they need to feel secure with their caregivers. Babies thrive when they're cared for by people who are emotionally invested in their well-being." After ending the call, Victoria stared at her computer screen, where email notifications were piling up, like digital accusations of neglect. Board meetings and merger discussions suddenly seemed abstract compared to the reality of a 5-pound baby who would need someone to care for him every few hours, around the clock, for the foreseeable future. "Jennifer," she said finally, "clear my calendar for the rest of the week, the entire week. But the Patterson presentation, reschedule everything. I need to learn how to take care of a baby." That evening, David brought Emma to the hospital to meet her baby brother. The 8-year-old had been asking questions non-stop since David had explained the situation, her natural curiosity combining with the emotional intelligence that serious illness had forced her to develop early. "Is he going to live with us?" Emma asked as they walked through the hospital corridors. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. It's complicated. Because of the lady who wants to take him away?" David paused, considering how to explain adult complexities to a child who'd already learned too much about life's unfairness. "Because his mother, the woman who wanted him to be born, she died. And now the people who loved her are trying to figure out how to take care of him the way she would have wanted." Emma processed this information with the seriousness that had become characteristic of her personality since her diagnosis. "Do you love him, Dad?" The question stopped David in his tracks. Love was such a big word, implying permanence and commitment that went far beyond biological connection. Yet watching Michael sleep, feeling the baby's complete trust when he held him, David had experienced something that felt very much like love. "I think I do, Em. I think I love him very much. Then he should stay with us. That's how families work." In the NICU, Emma approached her baby brother with the careful reverence she'd learned to apply to fragile things. Michael was awake, looking around with the unfocused attention of the very young, and when Emma spoke to him in the soft voice she used for sick animals and broken toys, he turned toward the sound. "Hi, baby brother," Emma whispered, settling into the chair beside David. "I'm Emma. I'm going to teach you lots of stuff when you get bigger, like how to build blanket forts and which cereal tastes best with chocolate milk." David watched his daughter fall in love with the baby who might or might not become part of their family, and felt his own resolve solidifying. Tomorrow Michael would leave the hospital, and someone would need to take him home. David looked around the NICU, at the tiny patients fighting for life with the help of machines and medicine, and thought about all the children who needed someone to fight for them. Michael made a small sound, and Emma giggled with delight. "Dad, I think he likes me." "I think he does too, sweetheart." Through the window, David could see Victoria approaching with what appeared to be several shopping bags and an expression of determined uncertainty. She'd come prepared for something, though David wasn't sure what. As she entered the NICU, her eyes immediately found the scene of Emma talking softly to Michael, while David watched with obvious pride. For the first time since they'd met, Victoria's perfect composure showed cracks around the edges, not from anger or frustration, but from something that looked remarkably like longing. Victoria had spent her entire adult life solving complex problems through research, analysis, and strategic thinking. Corporate mergers, hostile takeovers, labor negotiations, all had yielded to her methodical approach of gathering information, consulting experts, and implementing systematic solutions. Yet, standing in the baby section of an upscale department store at 7 in the morning, surrounded by shopping bags full of infant supplies, she felt utterly defeated by a 5-pound human being who communicated entirely through crying. The ultrasound photos she'd discovered in Helena's bedroom had changed everything. Hidden in a jewelry box alongside their mother's pearls, the grainy black and white images showed the baby's development from barely visible dot to recognizable human form. Helena had written notes in the margins: strong heartbeat at 12 weeks, first kicks felt at 18 weeks, perfect profile at 24 weeks, documenting a journey of hope and anticipation that Victoria had never suspected. There were dozens of photos, arranged chronologically, showing Helena's growing connection to the child she'd commissioned but never expected to raise herself. The final ultrasound, dated just 2 weeks before Michael's birth, included a handwritten note that made Victoria's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "He has David's stubborn chin already. I hope he gets his father's capacity for love." Now Victoria sat in her BMW outside David's apartment building, staring at the modest complex where Michael was spending his first week of life. The building needed paint, the parking lot had more cracks than asphalt, and the playground equipment looked like it had survived several decades of enthusiastic use. Everything about the place screamed working-class struggle. Yet through David's living room window, she could see warm light and the movements of a family going about their evening routine. She'd driven here with the intention of discussing custody arrangements and visitation schedules, the kind of legal framework that would allow her to fulfill her obligations while maintaining appropriate boundaries. Instead, she found herself curious about how David had transformed his small apartment into a nursery, how he balanced caring for a sick daughter and a newborn, and why the sight of his domestic competence made her feel so inadequate. Victoria climbed the stairs to David's second-floor apartment, her arms full of shopping bags containing everything the baby experts had recommended: organic formula, ergonomic bottles, developmental toys for newborns, a state-of-the-art baby monitor, and enough clothing to outfit triplets. She'd approached baby shopping like any other project, consulting reviews, comparing products, and selecting items based on research rather than instinct. David answered the door wearing jeans and a t-shirt that had seen better days, his hair disheveled and his eyes tired but alert. Over his shoulder, Victoria could hear the sounds of domestic life, Emma's voice asking questions, Michael's soft crying, and what sounded like a television playing children's programming. "Victoria," David said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I wasn't expecting you tonight. I brought some things for Michael." She gestured to the shopping bags, suddenly feeling foolish for arriving unannounced with what amounted to a small store's worth of baby supplies. "I researched the highest-rated products for newborn care." David's apartment was smaller than Victoria's walk-in closet, but it radiated the kind of warmth that no amount of expensive decorating could achieve. Emma was curled up on the couch with a blanket, her bald head covered by a soft pink cap, watching a nature documentary about penguins. Michael lay in a bassinet that David had clearly assembled himself, surrounded by the careful arrangements of someone learning parenthood through trial and error. "Emma, you remember Victoria," David said, settling Michael back into his bassinet after what had obviously been a feeding session. Emma looked up from her program, offering Victoria the shy smile that children reserve for adults they're not quite sure about. "Hi, Victoria. Dad says you're Michael's aunt." "That's right." Victoria set down her shopping bags, unsure of the protocol for interacting with an 8-year-old who'd been thrust into the role of big sister. "How is he settling in?" "He cries a lot at night, but Dad says that's normal for babies. I help with diaper changes and bottle feeding." Emma's voice carried the pride of someone who'd been given important responsibilities. "Dad taught me how to support his head properly. Victoria watched David move around the small space with practiced efficiency, tidying up bottles and burp cloths while keeping one eye on Michael and the other on Emma. This was what she'd been trying to hire professionals to provide, not just basic care, but the kind of attentive presence that anticipated needs before they became problems. "I brought some things," Victoria said, opening the first shopping bag to reveal perfectly folded baby clothes in neutral colors. The sales associate said these were the best for sensitive skin. David examined the tiny outfits, noting price tags that probably exceeded his monthly grocery budget. "They're beautiful, Victoria, really, but he's doing fine with what we have. I also brought formula, organic, with added vitamins, and we're actually doing well with the brand the hospital recommended. Michael seems to tolerate it without any digestive issues." Victoria felt a familiar frustration rising in her chest, the same sensation she experienced when her carefully researched solutions were dismissed in favor of simpler approaches. "I'm trying to help, David. I know you're managing now, but babies have increasing needs as they grow. Developmental toys, educational stimulation, proper nutrition. He's a week old, Victoria. Right now he needs food, diaper changes, and people who care about him. The educational stimulation can wait until he can focus his eyes properly." Emma giggled from the couch. "Victoria, babies don't need toys yet. They mostly just sleep and eat and poop. Dad showed me a book about baby development." Victoria looked between David and Emma, seeing the easy partnership they'd developed in caring for Michael. Emma might only be 8, but she moved around the baby with confidence, clearly comfortable with responsibilities that would have terrified most children her age. David watched both children with the vigilant attention of someone who understood that love meant constant awareness of potential needs. "How do you do it?" Victoria asked suddenly. "Work full-time, care for Emma's medical needs, and now take care of a newborn. Don't you get exhausted?" David settled into the worn armchair beside Michael's bassinet, close enough to respond immediately if the baby stirred. "Of course I get exhausted, but exhaustion isn't the same as defeat. You just figure out what needs to be done, and then you do it. But practically speaking, childcare costs, medical expenses, the time demands. Victoria, can I ask you something?" David's voice was gentle but direct. "When you were growing up, did you ever just sit with your sister and talk? Not about anything important, just talk?" The question caught Victoria off guard. She tried to remember lazy conversations with Helena, moments of sibling connection that weren't structured around family obligations or social expectations. The memories felt distant, obscured by years of competitive achievement and emotional distance. "Not really," Victoria admitted. "We were both very focused on our goals: academic success, career development, building independent lives. Emma and I talk all the time. About her day at school, about the books she's reading, about what she wants to be when she grows up." David glanced toward his daughter, who was now drowsing against her blanket. "Those conversations don't cost anything, but they're probably the most valuable part of our relationship." Victoria looked at Emma, seeing not just a sick child, but a person with opinions, dreams, and the kind of emotional intelligence that came from being truly listened to. "She's remarkable. She is. And she's going to be an amazing big sister to Michael, because she understands that love isn't about having the best stuff, it's about showing up consistently, even when it's inconvenient." Michael stirred in his bassinet, making the small noises that indicated he was waking up. David stood immediately, lifting the baby with the fluid motion of someone who'd already learned to read infant cues. Victoria watched, fascinated despite herself, as Michael immediately relaxed in David's arms. "Would you like to hold him?" David asked. Victoria felt panic flutter in her chest. I'm not good with babies." "Nobody's good with babies until they practice. He's sturdier than he looks." Before Victoria could protest further, David was transferring Michael to her arms, positioning her hands to support the baby's head and body. For a moment, Victoria felt awkward and terrified, certain she would somehow damage this tiny person who shared her sister's DNA. Then Michael opened his eyes and looked directly at her with the unfocused attention of the very young, and something shifted in Victoria's chest. "He's so small," she whispered. "But strong," David said. "Look at how he grips your finger." Victoria looked down to find that Michael had wrapped his tiny hand around her index finger, holding on with surprising strength. The simple contact created an unexpected connection, as if this small person was anchoring her to something she hadn't realized she was missing. "Helena would have loved this moment," Victoria said, surprising herself with the admission. "Tell me about her," David said, settling back into his chair. "What was she like before she decided she needed a child?" Victoria held Michael carefully, feeling the warmth of his small body against her chest. "Lonely, I think, though I didn't recognize it at the time. She traveled constantly, collected art, maintained this perfect apartment that never felt lived in. She was searching for something, but I thought it was just restlessness. Maybe she was searching for family. Maybe she was searching for the kind of connection you and Emma have," Victoria said, watching David's daughter sleep peacefully despite the conversation happening around her. "The kind I never learned how to create." Michael made a small sound, and Victoria instinctively adjusted her hold, surprised by how natural the movement felt. For the first time since Helena's death, Victoria began to understand what her sister had been trying to accomplish, not just having a baby, but creating the foundation for the kind of family that existed in moments like this, where love was expressed through presence rather than presence. The shoebox full of get-well cards sat on Emma's dresser like a testament to the power of community. Handmade cards from her second-grade classmates, thoughtful notes from neighbors, and elaborate creations from her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who'd organized the entire class around supporting Emma through her treatment. David had read every single card to Emma during her worst days, when chemotherapy left her too tired to lift her head from the pillow, and each one had carried the message that she was loved, missed, and worth fighting for. Now, 3 weeks after Michael's arrival, that same community had expanded its embrace to include the newest member of their unconventional family. Mrs. Rodriguez had appointed herself honorary grandmother, appearing daily with homemade soup and offers to hold the baby, while David handled Emma's medical appointments. The other parents from Emma's school had organized meal deliveries, understanding that a single father juggling a sick daughter and a newborn might need practical support more than sympathy. Victoria had been witness to this outpouring of care with something approaching wonder. In her world, support systems were transactional, hired help, professional services, paid assistance that could be scheduled and managed like any other business relationship. The idea that neighbors would simply show up with food, that strangers would send handmade cards, that an entire elementary school would rally around one family's struggles, existed outside her experience entirely. She'd been staying in a furnished corporate apartment 10 minutes from David's building, close enough to help with Michael's care, but far enough to maintain the illusion that this was a temporary arrangement. Her plan had been to gradually assume more responsibility for Michael, while helping David transition back to his normal routine. Instead, she found herself drawn deeper into their daily life, discovering that caring for a baby required the kind of moment-to-moment attention that left little room for strategic planning. "He's definitely your son," Victoria observed, settling into David's kitchen with Michael against her shoulder. It was early morning, and Emma was still sleeping while David prepared for another day of balancing construction work with infant care. Same stubborn streak, same way of demanding attention when he wants something. David smiled, noting how naturally Victoria had learned to position Michael for optimal burping. 3 weeks ago, she'd held the baby like he was made of glass and explosives. Now she moved with the confidence of someone who'd discovered that love was more about consistency than expertise. "He's got Helena's timing, though. Always knows the exact moment when I'm trying to do something else." Victoria had gradually taken over the night feeding schedule, arriving at David's apartment around midnight and staying until morning. She told herself it was purely practical. David needed sleep to function at work, and she could afford to be tired during board meetings. But the truth was more complicated. Those quiet hours with Michael, feeding him while the world slept around them, had become the most peaceful part of her day. "David, we need to talk about the long-term arrangements," Victoria said, though the words felt inadequate for the complexity of their situation. "My company is pressuring me to travel more, and you can't keep taking time off for every feeding and diaper change." "I know." David poured coffee into two mismatched mugs, both displaying the logos of construction companies that had probably folded years ago. "Tony's been patient, but I can't ask him to hold my job forever while I figure out how to be a single father to 2 kids. 3 kids, Victoria corrected quietly. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither had been willing to address directly. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, the legal fiction of shared custody had evolved into something that looked remarkably like co-parenting. Victoria had developed opinions about Michael's feeding schedule, preferences for certain brands of diapers, and the kind of protective instincts that emerged automatically when the baby cried. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, her thin frame wrapped in the oversized bathrobe that David had bought during her first hospital stay. Her hair was growing back in uneven patches, but her eyes were bright with the alertness that had returned as her latest treatment round began showing success. "Is Michael being fussy again?" Emma asked, settling at the kitchen table with the careful movements of someone still rebuilding their strength. "Just hungry," Victoria replied, adjusting the baby's position so Emma could see his face. "He woke up 20 minutes early. I think he's starting to establish his own schedule." Emma giggled. "Dad says babies are like little bosses who can't talk yet. They just cry until you figure out what they want." "Your dad is very wise about babies," Victoria said, catching David's amused expression. Among other things, David had been watching Victoria's transformation with something approaching amazement. The woman who'd arrived at the hospital 3 weeks ago, demanding immediate custody transfer, had evolved into someone who spoke baby talk without self-consciousness, who worried about Michael's sleep patterns, and who'd somehow learned to navigate Emma's complex emotional needs with surprising sensitivity. "Victoria," Emma said suddenly, "are you going to be Michael's mom?" The question caught Victoria off guard, forcing her to confront a possibility she'd been avoiding through careful focus on practical arrangements. In Emma's 8-year-old logic, adults who cared for babies were parents, regardless of legal terminology or genetic relationships. "That's complicated, sweetheart," Victoria said carefully. "Michael's mother was my sister Helena, and she died when he was born. Now your dad and I are working together to take care of him. But you love him, right?" Emma's directness carried the kind of clarity that adults often lost in their attempts to complicate simple truths. Victoria looked down at Michael, who was now sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, his tiny hand curled around a strand of her hair. Did she love him? The question seemed almost too large for the quiet kitchen where they sat drinking coffee and planning another day of shared responsibility. "Yes," Victoria said finally, "I love him very much." "Then you're his mom," Emma concluded with the kind of logic that brooked no argument. "Maybe not the mom who gave birth to him, but the mom who takes care of him every day." David felt something shift in his chest as he watched Victoria process Emma's simple declaration. The corporate executive who'd built her identity around professional achievement was being redefined by an 8-year-old's understanding of what family meant. "Emma, would you be okay with that?" Victoria asked. "If I became Michael's mom, I'd be around a lot more. I'd be part of your family." Emma considered this with the seriousness that children apply to matters of genuine importance. "Would you still let Dad be Michael's dad?" "Of course, your dad is a wonderful father." "And would you help take care of me too, when I have to go to the doctor and stuff?" Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes, recognizing the depth of trust implicit in Emma's question. This child, who'd learned too early that adults could disappear without warning, was asking whether Victoria could be counted on during the difficult moments that defined serious illness. "If you wanted me to, yes. I'd like to help take care of you too." Emma nodded decisively. "Then it's okay with me. We can be a family with 2 moms and 1 dad and 2 kids." David watched his daughter embrace the concept of their unconventional family structure with the adaptability that had carried her through months of medical treatments. Emma had learned that families could take many forms: single fathers, helpful neighbors, medical teams that became extended support systems, and Victoria's presence simply represented another variation on the theme of people who showed up when they were needed. "There's something else we need to discuss," Victoria said, shifting Michael to her other arm. "Helena's estate includes a trust fund for Michael's education and care. It's substantial enough to ensure he'll never want for anything." "Victoria, let me finish. The money comes with conditions that Helena specified before her death. It can only be used for Michael's benefit, and any decisions about his care, education, healthcare, where he lives have to be made jointly by both guardians." David understood the implication immediately. Helena had designed her will to prevent either guardian from making unilateral decisions about Michael's future. Victoria couldn't simply hire the best nannies and boarding schools money could buy, and David couldn't reject professional advantages out of stubborn pride. "She really thought this through," David said. "Helena was always thorough when she wanted something. But I think she was also trying to ensure that Michael would be raised by people who understood the difference between providing for a child and actually parenting them." Emma finished her breakfast and approached Victoria's chair, studying Michael's sleeping face with the intense concentration she applied to everything that interested her. "He looks like Dad when he sleeps. Same eyebrows." "He has your dad's stubborn chin too," Victoria observed. "And your sister's delicate features," David added, noting the baby's small nose and perfectly formed ears. Emma looked between the 2 adults, seeing something in their interaction that made her smile with 8-year-old satisfaction. "I think Helena would be happy that we're all together taking care of Michael." Victoria felt the truth of Emma's observation settle in her chest like a warm weight. Helena had orchestrated this situation not just to ensure Michael's care, but to create the possibility of connection that had been missing from both women's lives. Through her death, Helena had given Victoria something she'd never known. She wanted a family that existed not through obligation or genetics, but through the daily choice to show up for each other. Michael stirred in Victoria's arms, opening his eyes and looking around with the increasing awareness that marked his development from newborn to infant. When his gaze found Victoria's face, he smiled a real smile, not the reflexive expression of gas or contentment, but recognition and response. "He knows you," Emma said with delight. "He knows you're his mum." Victoria felt her heart expand in a way that no business success had ever accomplished, understanding finally what Helena had been searching for in those lonely years before Michael's conception. Not just a child to love, but the experience of being needed, of mattering to another person in the most fundamental way possible. "Yes," Victoria whispered, holding Michael close while David and Emma watched with expressions of complete acceptance. "I think he does." The baby's first blanket lay folded in the bottom drawer of Helena's dresser, underneath silk scarves and jewelry that would never be worn again. Victoria had been avoiding the task of sorting through her sister's personal belongings, but Michael's rapid growth had made it necessary to find the items Helena had prepared for his arrival. What she discovered instead was evidence of a deception so carefully orchestrated that it redefined everything she thought she knew about her sister's final months. The blanket itself was beautiful, hand-knitted in soft blue and cream, with intricate patterns that must have taken months to complete. Attached was a note in Helena's careful handwriting. "For my son, with love that transcends blood. May you always know that family is made not by genetics, but by the choice to care for one another unconditionally." But beneath the blanket, Victoria found something that stopped her cold, a manila envelope marked, "For Victoria to be opened after my death." Inside were medical records, legal documents, and a letter written in Helena's voice, but revealing a truth that Victoria had never suspected. The letter began simply, "My dear sister, if you are reading this, then my plan has worked exactly as I hoped, though not as I originally intended." Victoria sat on Helena's bed, surrounded by the remnants of a life she'd thought she understood, and continued reading with growing shock. "I need you to know that everything you believe about Michael's conception is both true and false. Yes, I hired David Martinez to father my child. Yes, I paid him $2 million for that service. But what you don't know, what no one knows except my doctors, is that I was dying when I made that arrangement." Victoria's hands began to shake as she absorbed the implications of Helena's words. "I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 13 months ago. The doctors gave me 6 to 9 months to live. I chose not to tell you because I knew you would insist on experimental treatments, second opinions, trips to specialized clinics, all the things that corporate executives do when faced with problems that money should be able to solve. But some problems can't be solved, Victoria. They can only be accepted." The medical records confirmed everything Helena had written. Oncology reports, tumor markers, treatment plans that focused on comfort rather than cure. Helena had been dying from the moment she'd placed that classified ad, working against a timeline that made her decision to have a child not selfish, but desperate. "I didn't want a baby to fill my empty life, Victoria. I wanted a baby to fill yours." Victoria felt the room spin around her as she understood the true scope of Helena's manipulation. "I've watched you build a brilliant career and a successful company, but I've also watched you become increasingly isolated from any kind of meaningful human connection. You work 16-hour days because you don't have anyone waiting for you at home. You've never learned to love something more than you love control." The letter continued with painful honesty. "I knew that if I simply died and left you my estate, you'd donate the money to charity and continue living your careful, emotionally protected life. But if I died and left you a baby who needed not just financial support but daily care, emotional connection, and the kind of love that requires vulnerability, you might finally understand what you've been missing." Victoria set down the letter, her mind racing to reconstruct Helena's final months with this new information. The surrogacy arrangement hadn't been about Helena's desire for motherhood, it had been about Victoria's need for family. Helena had engineered the entire situation, including David's involvement, as an elaborate gift to the sister she was about to leave behind. But there was more. Victoria picked up the letter again, finding that Helena had anticipated even this moment of discovery. "I know you're probably feeling manipulated right now, and you have every right to be angry with me. But before you decide that this was simply another one of my dramatic gestures, I need you to understand something about David Martinez." Helena's handwriting grew shakier as the letter progressed, evidence of declining health during its composition. "I didn't choose David randomly. I spent months researching potential fathers, but David was the only one who reminded me of you. Not physically, but emotionally. He's someone who's learned to love completely despite loss, who puts his child's needs above his own comfort, who understands that being a parent means showing up every day, regardless of how you feel." Victoria thought about David's devotion to Emma, his instinctive care for Michael, his ability to create warmth and security in a 2-bedroom apartment with second-hand furniture. "I chose David because I hoped that learning to co-parent with him would teach you what I never could. That love isn't about control or perfection or having all the answers. It's about choosing to be present for another person, even when that presence requires you to change everything about how you live your life." The letter's final paragraph made Victoria understand the full complexity of Helena's plan. "The will I wrote includes provisions that require you and David to make decisions about Michael together, because I knew that raising a child would force you to practice collaboration, compromise, and trust, all the things you've spent your career avoiding. I designed the financial arrangements to ensure that neither of you could simply buy your way out of the messy daily work of being a family. Victoria reached for the final document in the envelope, an addendum to Helena's will that she'd never seen before. In it, Helena had left specific instructions that the trust fund for Michael's care included provisions for Emma's medical expenses, David's living costs, and Victoria's gradual transition away from full-time corporate work. "I don't expect you to become a traditional stay-at-home mother, Victoria, but I hope you'll discover that there's more than one way to be successful and that the most important achievements can't be measured in quarterly reports." The hidden will also revealed that Helena had arranged for her personal journals to be given to Victoria after Michael's first birthday, documenting not just her illness, but her growing understanding of what family meant and her regrets about the emotional distance that had characterized their relationship. Victoria sat in Helena's bedroom, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate and loving deception she'd ever encountered. Her sister had spent the final months of her life orchestrating a situation that would force Victoria to confront everything she'd been avoiding: vulnerability, dependence, the terrifying possibility that love might be more important than achievement. The sound of her phone ringing broke through Victoria's shock. David's name appeared on the screen and she answered automatically. "Victoria? Is everything okay? You sound—" "I'm at Helena's apartment, I found." Victoria's voice cracked. "David, I found letters from Helena. She knew she was dying when she hired you." Silence on the other end of the line, then David's voice, careful and quiet. "What do you mean?" "I mean, she had pancreatic cancer. Terminal. She had maybe 6 months to live when she placed that ad looking for a father for her child." Victoria wiped tears from her cheeks, surprised by their presence. "She didn't want a baby for herself, David. She wanted a baby for me. Victoria, she knew I'd never learn to love anything if she didn't force me into a situation where I had no choice. So she arranged for me to inherit a child who would need daily care, emotional connection, and the kind of presence I've spent my entire life avoiding." Victoria could hear Michael's soft sounds in the background, the domestic noises of David's apartment that had become so familiar over the past month. "She chose you specifically because she thought you could teach me how to be a parent, how to put someone else's needs first." "How to?" Victoria stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Helena's sacrifice. "How to love," David finished quietly. "She gave up her last months of life to orchestrate our meeting. She died so that Michael could bring us together, could create the family she thought I needed, but would never choose for myself." David was quiet for a long moment, and Victoria could imagine him processing this revelation while holding Michael, surrounded by the simple domestic peace that had become their routine. "Victoria, does this change anything for you, knowing that Helena planned all of this?" Victoria looked around Helena's perfectly appointed bedroom, at the ultrasound photos arranged on the nightstand, at the baby clothes that had been purchased with love rather than necessity. "It changes everything and nothing," she said finally. "Helena was right about me, David. I was so afraid of losing control that I'd forgotten how to connect with another person. But she was also right about you." "What do you mean?" "You've taught me that being a parent isn't about having the right answers or the best resources. It's about showing up consistently and caring more about someone else's well-being than your own comfort." Victoria stood up, gathering Helena's letters and the baby blanket. She knew that if I learned to love Michael, I might also learn to love you. The admission hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Victoria had been avoiding but could no longer deny. Somewhere in the past month of shared feedings, sleepless nights, and daily negotiations about Michael's care, her feelings for David had evolved beyond mere co-parenting cooperation. "Victoria," David said gently, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Helena was right about everything, about what I needed, about what you could teach me, about what Michael could give us both." Victoria felt certainty settling in her chest, like coming home. "I'm saying that I love our son, and I love Emma, and I love you." "Are you sure? Because what we've been building together, it's complicated and messy and nothing like the life you had planned." Victoria smiled, thinking about Emma's get-well cards and Mrs. Rodriguez's soup and the way Michael looked at her when she sang him to sleep. David, I've spent my entire adult life pursuing things that looked perfect from the outside but felt empty on the inside. What we have is complicated and messy and absolutely nothing like I planned. It's also the most real thing I've ever experienced. When Victoria arrived at David's apartment an hour later, she found him reading to Emma while Michael slept in his bassinet. The scene was so completely ordinary and so completely precious that she understood finally what Helena had been trying to give her, not just a child to love, but a life worth living. "Did you mean what you said on the phone?" David asked, as she settled beside him on the couch. "Every word." Victoria reached for Michael, lifting him from his bassinet and settling him against her chest. "Helena was right about us, David. We make a good team." Emma looked up from her book, studying the adults with the perceptive intelligence that serious illness had forced her to develop. "Are you and Dad going to get married?" Victoria felt her heart skip at the 8-year-old's directness. "Would that be okay with you?" "As long as you promise to stay," Emma said seriously. "Even when things get hard or scary, Dad and I have learned that families have to stick together no matter what." Victoria looked at David, seeing in his expression the same hope and uncertainty she was feeling. Helena had given them more than a child. She'd given them the opportunity to choose love over fear, connection over control, family over solitude. "I promise to stay," Victoria said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "For all of us, through everything." Helena's final gift had been to show Victoria that love wasn't something to be earned or achieved, it was something to be chosen, daily and deliberately, even when the choice required becoming a completely different person than you'd ever imagined being. The airplane tickets lay spread across David's kitchen table like promises of an impossible future. 3 first-class seats to Zurich, Switzerland, departing in 6 days. Emma's name was printed on one ticket, David's on another, and Victoria's on the third. The 4th passenger, Michael, would travel on Victoria's lap, too young to require his own seat, but old enough to have fundamentally changed the mathematics of their family. Dr. Peterson had called the previous morning with news that had sent their carefully ordered world spinning into chaos. Emma's latest blood work showed concerning markers that suggested her current treatment was losing effectiveness. The experimental immunotherapy program in Switzerland, the same treatment David had researched during those desperate nights months ago, had an opening, but only if they could arrive within the week. "The timing isn't ideal," Dr. Peterson had explained in his careful, clinical voice. "Emma would need to be in Zurich for a minimum of 6 weeks, possibly longer. The treatment protocol is intensive, and she'd need a full-time caregiver, preferably family, throughout the process." Victoria had made the arrangements within hours: flights, accommodations, consultations with the Swiss medical team, and temporary custody documentation that would allow Michael to travel internationally. She'd approached Emma's medical crisis with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to corporate emergencies, but this time her efficiency was motivated by love rather than professional obligation. "You don't have to come with us," David said for the 4th time since Victoria had presented the tickets. He was holding Michael, who'd grown noticeably in the 6 weeks since his birth, developing the kind of alert awareness that made him seem less like a fragile newborn and more like a small person with opinions about his surroundings. "David, we've been through this." Victoria folded baby clothes into a suitcase with movements that had become automatic through weeks of shared childcare. "Emma needs both of us. Michael needs both of us. I'm not letting you handle this alone." Emma sat at the kitchen table, coloring in a book about Swiss mountains that Victoria had bought to help her understand their destination. Her latest round of chemotherapy had left her tired but hopeful, and she'd embraced the idea of traveling to Switzerland with the adaptability that had carried her through months of medical uncertainty. "Will there be snow?" Emma asked, carefully shading a picture of the Alps. "Probably not in the valleys where we'll be staying," Victoria replied, "but definitely on the mountains. The hospital has wonderful views, and when you're feeling up to it, we can take walks around Lake Zurich. David watched Victoria interact with Emma, marveling at how naturally she'd learned to balance honesty about medical realities with age-appropriate optimism. 2 months ago, Victoria had been a stranger who viewed children as small, unpredictable adults. Now she understood Emma's need for information tempered with reassurance, her desire to feel included in decisions that affected her life. "What about Michael?" Emma asked. "Will he like Switzerland?" "Michael will like being wherever we are," Victoria said, settling beside Emma at the table. "Babies mostly care about being fed, kept warm, and held by people who love them. As long as we're all together, he'll be fine." The truth was more complicated than Victoria's reassuring words suggested. Traveling internationally with a 6-week-old baby while supporting an 8-year-old through intensive medical treatment would test every assumption they'd made about their ability to function as a family unit. David would need to navigate a foreign healthcare system while managing his anxiety about Emma's condition. Victoria would need to maintain her emotional stability while caring for Michael in unfamiliar surroundings. And all of them would need to adjust to living in close quarters for an extended period, with no escape routes or familiar support systems. "I called my office this morning," Victoria said, checking items off a list that had grown to include everything from international phone plans to emergency contacts for the Swiss clinic. "I'm taking an indefinite leave of absence." David looked up from Michael's sleepy face. "Victoria, you don't need to." "Yes, I do." Victoria's voice carried the same determination that had once driven her corporate success, now redirected toward family preservation. "Emma needs consistency during her treatment. Michael needs his parents, and I need to be here for both of them." The decision to step away from Blackwell Industries hadn't been easy, but it had been surprisingly clear. Victoria had built her professional identity around the belief that success meant controlling outcomes through strategic planning and resource management. Emma's illness had taught her that some outcomes couldn't be controlled, only navigated with love, patience, and the willingness to adapt when circumstances changed beyond recognition. "What about your company?" David asked. "The company will survive. My assistant Jennifer is more than capable of handling day-to-day operations, and the board has been wanting me to consider succession planning anyway." Victoria smiled, recognizing the irony of stepping back from her career at the moment when her personal life was demanding everything she had to give. "Turns out there are more important things than quarterly profits." Emma looked up from her coloring book, studying Victoria with the intense attention she reserved for matters of genuine significance. "Victoria, are you sure you want to come with us? It might be scary sometimes." The question revealed Emma's own fear about the upcoming treatment, disguised as concern for the adults around her. At 8 years old, she'd learned that medical procedures could be unpredictable, that even the best intentions couldn't guarantee positive outcomes, and that the people she loved might not always be able to protect her from pain. Victoria reached across the table, covering Emma's small hand with her own. "Emma, do you remember what you told me about families sticking together no matter what?" Emma nodded. "Well, that works both ways. You don't get to worry about whether I can handle the scary parts. My job is to be here for you during the scary parts, just like your dad has been doing since you got sick." "But what if the treatment doesn't work?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper, finally expressing the fear that had been hovering around the edges of all their preparations. David set Michael in his bouncy seat and moved to Emma's other side, creating a protective circle around her fears. "Then we'll figure out what comes next, together. But this treatment has helped a lot of kids who were as sick as you are. Dr. Peterson thinks you have a really good chance. And no matter what happens," Victoria added, "you'll never have to face it alone. Your dad and I and Michael, we're your family. That means we're going to be right beside you through everything." Emma studied both adults' faces, searching for the kind of certainty that neither could honestly provide. What she found instead was something more valuable, the absolute commitment of people who'd chosen to love her regardless of outcomes. Okay, Emma said finally. I'm ready to go to Switzerland. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation that revealed how completely their lives had intertwined over the past 2 months. Victoria coordinated with the Swiss medical team, while David arranged extended leave from his construction job. They contacted Emma's school, organized mail forwarding, and prepared Michael's documentation for international travel. Mrs. Rodriguez agreed to water David's plants and collect packages, accepting her role in their extended family with the matter-of-fact kindness that had sustained them through the early weeks of Michael's life. "You know, this changes everything, don't you?" David said on their final night in the apartment. They were sitting on his couch after putting both children to bed, surrounded by packed suitcases and the familiar disorder of a family preparing for major transition. "What do you mean?" "Switzerland. Living together for weeks, maybe months, sharing responsibility for Emma's medical care and Michael's development in a foreign country where we won't have any of our usual support systems." David looked around the small apartment that had become their refuge. "We'll be completely dependent on each other." Victoria understood what he was really asking. Their relationship had developed gradually, built on shared responsibility and growing affection that had deepened into love through daily proximity and common purpose. But Switzerland would test whether their connection could survive the intense pressure of Emma's medical crisis, combined with the isolation of being strangers in a foreign country. "Are you worried?" Victoria asked. "Terrified," David admitted. "Not about Emma's treatment. I have faith in the Swiss doctors and her strength. But about us, about whether what we've built here can survive that kind of stress." Victoria reached for his hand, feeling the calluses that marked his years of construction work and the gentleness that marked his approach to fatherhood. "David, 3 months ago I thought success meant controlling every variable and eliminating emotional risk. Emma and Michael have taught me that the most important things in life require exactly the opposite, accepting uncertainty and choosing love despite the possibility of loss. That's a beautiful sentiment, but Switzerland is going to test it in ways we can't predict. Then we'll face those tests together." Victoria squeezed his hand. "Besides, I think Helena would approve of us taking this leap of faith. She spent her final months orchestrating a situation that would force me to choose family over safety. Following Emma to Switzerland feels like honoring that gift." David smiled, thinking about Helena's elaborate plan to create the family she'd believed Victoria needed. She really did think of everything, didn't she? Almost everything. I don't think she anticipated how completely I'd fall in love with all of you. Even the midnight feedings and diaper emergencies and 8-year-old medical anxiety, especially those things. Victoria leaned against David's shoulder, feeling the solid comfort of his presence. Those are the moments when love stops being an abstract concept and becomes a daily choice to show up for the people who need you. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their children sleeping in the next room. In 6 days, they would board a plane to Switzerland, carrying with them Emma's hopes for healing, Michael's trust in their ability to care for him anywhere, and their own fragile certainty that love was worth any risk. "Victoria," David said quietly, "regardless of what happens in Switzerland with Emma's treatment, with us, with any of it, I want you to know that these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life." "Mine too," Victoria replied, meaning it completely. "Helena was right about everything, David. Love isn't about having guarantees or perfect circumstances. It's about choosing to build something beautiful with another person, even when you don't know how the story ends." Outside, snow was beginning to fall, unusual for their city in early spring, but somehow appropriate for a family preparing to chase healing in the Swiss mountains. Victoria watched the flakes drift past David's living room window and thought about the airplane tickets on the kitchen table, about Emma's quiet courage, about Michael's trusting sleep, and about the extraordinary gift of being chosen by this unlikely family. Switzerland would test everything they'd built together, but Victoria was no longer afraid of tests she couldn't control. She'd learned that the most important victories came not from managing outcomes, but from showing up with love, patience, and the willingness to embrace whatever came next. The Swiss clinic felt like stepping into a medical fairy tale, nestled in the foothills of the Alps, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of snow-capped peaks and pristine lakes. The facility represented everything that cutting-edge healthcare could achieve, when resources weren't constrained by insurance limitations or bureaucratic restrictions. Emma pressed her face against the airplane window during their descent into Zurich, marveling at the landscape that looked like something from the storybooks Victoria had been reading to her during the flight. "It's like a castle," Emma whispered, pointing at the clinic's elegant architecture when their taxi pulled up to the main entrance. The building seemed to grow from the landscape itself, all clean lines and natural materials that suggested healing through harmony with the environment. Michael had traveled better than any of them had expected. At 7 weeks old, he'd slept through most of the transatlantic flight, waking only for feedings that Victoria managed with the practiced efficiency she'd developed during their months of shared parenting. David had worried about the disruption to Michael's routine, but the baby seemed to thrive on the constant attention from his makeshift family, content as long as he was being held by familiar hands. Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, the lead physician for Emma's treatment protocol, met them in the clinic's reception area with the kind of calm competence that immediately inspired confidence. She was perhaps 50, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that managed to convey both professional authority and genuine warmth. When she shook Emma's hand, she spoke directly to the 8-year-old rather than addressing the adults first. "Emma, I'm very glad you decided to come to Switzerland for your treatment. I've been reviewing your medical records, and I think our program will be exactly what you need to get completely better." Emma studied Dr. Hoffman's face with the careful attention she'd learned to apply to medical professionals. "Will it hurt? Some parts might be uncomfortable," Dr. Hoffman replied honestly, "but nothing like the chemotherapy you've already been through. This treatment works by teaching your own immune system to fight the cancer cells, so mostly you'll just feel tired while your body learns new ways to heal itself." The family apartment the clinic had arranged exceeded even Victoria's expectations. 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a living area that opened onto a private balcony overlooking Lake Zurich. Michael's portable crib fit perfectly in the master bedroom, while Emma's room included a study area where she could continue her schoolwork between treatment sessions. "This is bigger than our apartment at home," Emma observed, settling into the window seat that offered panoramic views of the Swiss countryside. "And probably costs more per night than Dad makes in a month," David added quietly, still adjusting to the reality of Switzerland's luxury medical tourism industry. Victoria was unpacking Michael's travel supplies, transforming the unfamiliar space into something that resembled their domestic routines back home. Helena's trust fund was designed for exactly this kind of situation, she reminded David. She wanted to ensure that money would never be an obstacle to getting the best possible care for the people we love. The clinic's family-centered approach became apparent immediately. Unlike the sterile hospital environments they'd known in the States, the Swiss facility felt more like a high-end resort that happened to offer world-class medical treatment. Emma's treatment schedule allowed for plenty of rest, recreation, and family time. David and Victoria were encouraged to participate in her care, attending educational sessions about the immunotherapy process and learning techniques for managing treatment side effects. "The family dynamics are as important as the medical protocols," Dr. Hoffman explained during their orientation meeting. "Children heal faster when they feel secure and supported. We've found that patients who travel with committed family units tend to respond better to treatment than those who come alone." David felt a surge of gratitude for Victoria's presence as Dr. Hoffman spoke. 2 months ago, he would have faced Emma's medical crisis as a single father, carrying the emotional weight of her illness while trying to maintain optimism for her sake. Having Victoria beside him, sharing the responsibility, offering alternative perspectives, providing emotional support when his own reserves ran low, felt like a miracle he'd never thought to request. On their third day in Switzerland, Emma began her first immunotherapy session. The process was remarkably unremarkable. She sat in a comfortable recliner while specialized cells were introduced into her bloodstream through an IV line, reading books and playing quiet games while her immune system received its new instructions. Victoria sat on one side of the recliner, David on the other, with Michael sleeping peacefully in Victoria's arms. "This is so much better than chemotherapy," Emma declared after her first hour of treatment. "I don't feel sick at all. The effects build gradually." "Dr. Hoffman explained, "Your body will start working harder over the next few weeks, which might make you tired, but you shouldn't experience the nausea or severe fatigue you had with the previous treatments." That evening, they celebrated Emma's successful first session with dinner on their balcony, sharing Swiss cheese and bread while watching the sun set over Lake Zurich. Michael had discovered his voice during the flight and was experimenting with soft coos and gurgles that made Emma laugh with delight. "He's trying to talk to us," Emma said, leaning over Michael's travel seat to make silly faces that prompted more baby sounds. "He's probably telling us about the airplane," Victoria suggested. "That was his first big adventure." David watched Victoria interact with both children, marveling at how completely she'd embraced the chaos and uncertainty of family life. The woman who'd once scheduled meetings months in advance was now adapting to Emma's unpredictable energy levels and Michael's irregular feeding schedule without complaint, finding joy in the small moments that define daily life with children. "Victoria," Emma said suddenly, "when we go home, are you going to live with us permanently?" The question hung in the alpine air, carrying implications that all three adults had been avoiding through their focus on immediate medical concerns. Their living arrangement in Switzerland felt natural, shared responsibilities, common goals, the kind of domestic partnership that had evolved organically from practical necessity. But returning home would require explicit decisions about their future as a family unit. "Would you want me to live with you permanently?" Victoria asked. Emma considered this with 8-year-old seriousness. "Only if you really want to. Dad and I learned that families work best when people choose to be together, not when they feel like they have to be together." David felt his heart expand as he listened to his daughter express wisdom that many adults struggled to understand. Emma had learned through her illness that authentic relationships required genuine choice rather than obligation, that love expressed through duty felt different than love expressed through desire. "I really want to," Victoria said simply. "I want to be part of your family, Emma, forever, if you and your dad will have me, and Michael too. And Michael too. We're all connected now, you and your dad and Michael and me. What do you think about that?" Emma looked around the balcony where they sat, taking in the view of Swiss mountains, the sound of Michael's contented baby noises, and the sight of the two adults who'd learned to love her during the most frightening period of her young life. "I think Helena would be really happy," Emma said finally. "I think she'd like that Michael has a whole family to take care of him, and that you learned how to be a mom, and that Dad doesn't have to worry about everything by himself anymore." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes as she understood that Emma's acceptance represented more than approval of their relationship. It was recognition that they'd successfully created the kind of family that Helena had envisioned when she'd orchestrated their meeting. Not a perfect family, but a chosen family, bound together by commitment rather than genetics, by daily care rather than legal obligation. "I love you, Emma," Victoria said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I love you too," Emma replied. "All of us together, that's what family means." As if to underscore Emma's declaration, Michael chose that moment to reach up from his travel seat, grasping Victoria's finger with the determined grip that had become his signature gesture. David leaned over to kiss Victoria's forehead, and Emma curled up against his side, and for a moment their unconventional family felt like the most natural thing in the world. The Swiss mountains watched over them as night fell, and Lake Zurich reflected the lights of a dozen villages, and Victoria understood finally what Helena had tried to give her, not just a child to love, but the experience of being completely, authentically happy. The child's drawing was taped to the refrigerator in their Swiss apartment, a riot of crayon colors that depicted their family with the joyful inaccuracy of 8-year-old artistry. Emma had drawn herself with bright yellow hair that she'd lost to chemotherapy. David, with arms that stretched impossibly wide to embrace everyone. Victoria in a purple dress, holding a baby that looked more like a smiling orange than an actual infant, and all of them standing in front of what might have been mountains or very tall trees. Family in Switzerland was written across the top in Emma's careful handwriting, and beneath each figure she'd labeled them me, Dad, Victoria, Mom, and Baby Michael. The casual addition of parenthetical motherhood had made Victoria cry when she'd discovered it. Understanding that Emma's acceptance represented the kind of recognition that couldn't be legislated or negotiated, only earned through consistent presence during both ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. 3 weeks into Emma's treatment, the family had established routines that felt surprisingly natural despite their temporary circumstances. Mornings began with Emma's medical appointments, where Victoria and David took turns accompanying her while the other cared for Michael. Afternoons were for exploration walks around Lake Zurich, when Emma felt energetic, quiet time in the apartment when the treatment left her tired, and always the shared meals that had become the cornerstone of their daily life together. Michael was thriving in the Swiss environment, developing the kind of alert awareness that marked his transition from newborn to infant. At 2 months old, he was beginning to smile responsively, track faces with his eyes, and make the soft sounds that suggested he was trying to participate in family conversations. Dr. Hoffman had remarked on how calm and content he seemed, attributing his peaceful demeanor to the stable, loving care he received from multiple devoted adults. Babies can sense family harmony, she'd observed during one of Emma's treatment sessions. Michael knows he's safe and cherished. That's the best foundation any child can have. Emma's response to the immunotherapy exceeded even Dr. Hoffman's optimistic projections. Her energy levels were returning, her blood markers were improving steadily, and the scans showed significant reduction in the cancer cells that had been slowly destroying her immune system. Most importantly, Emma herself was beginning to believe in her own recovery, talking about future plans with the confidence of a child who expected to live long enough to achieve them. "When we get home, I want to teach Michael how to finger paint," Emma announced during their evening walk around the lake. "He's too little now, but when he gets bigger, I bet he'll like getting messy." "That sounds like an excellent plan," Victoria replied, pushing Michael's stroller along the path that wound between carefully tended gardens and scenic overlooks. "Though you might want to warn your father before you introduce Michael to finger painting. He's very particular about keeping the apartment clean." David laughed, recognizing the gentle teasing that had become a comfortable part of their family dynamic. "I'm not particular about cleanliness. I'm practical about damage control. There's a difference." Dad once spent an entire afternoon cleaning purple paint out of the kitchen cabinets after I tried to redecorate, Emma told Victoria conspiratorially. "I was 6, and I thought the kitchen would look better with more colors." "Did it look better?" Victoria asked seriously. Emma considered this question with characteristic honesty. "Actually, yes. But Dad said we couldn't afford to repaint the whole apartment just because I decided the walls were boring." Victoria had been learning about David's history as a single father through dozens of such stories, small anecdotes that revealed the careful balance he'd maintained between encouraging Emma's creativity and managing their practical limitations. His approach to parenting combined flexibility with gentle boundaries, allowing Emma to explore her world while keeping her safe from consequences she wasn't old enough to understand. "Victoria," Emma said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the path to look up at the woman who'd become her second mother. "Will you marry Dad?" The question was delivered with Emma's characteristic directness, but Victoria could hear the deeper concern beneath the words. Emma had learned that adults could disappear without warning, that love didn't always guarantee permanence, and that families could be broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control. "Is that something you'd want?" Victoria asked carefully. "I want us to be a real family forever," Emma said. "Not just while we're in Switzerland, but when we go home too. I want Michael to grow up knowing that you and Dad belong to each other, and that all of us belong together." David felt his heart constrict as he listened to his daughter express the same hopes he'd been carrying but hadn't known how to voice. The past 3 months had shown him what life could be like, with a true partner, someone who shared not just the daily work of childcare, but the emotional weight of parenting decisions, the joy of small victories, and the fear that came with loving someone whose future wasn't guaranteed. "Emma," David said gently, "that's something Victoria and I would need to decide together. Marriage is a big commitment. But you love each other, right?" Emma's 8-year-old logic cut straight to the heart of adult complexity. "And you both love Michael and me, and we all live together and take care of each other. That sounds like marriage to me." Victoria stopped walking, turning to face David across Michael's stroller. The Swiss sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and pink, and Lake Zurich reflected the colors like a mirror designed to showcase perfect moments. This wasn't how she'd ever imagined receiving a marriage proposal from an 8-year-old in a foreign country while caring for a baby who'd brought them together through the most elaborate matchmaking scheme in history. "David," Victoria said quietly, "Emma's right. About all of it. We do love each other. We are a family, and I can't imagine going back to the life I had before Michael brought us together." David reached across the stroller, taking Victoria's hand in his calloused grip. "Victoria Blackwell, are you proposing to me?" "I think our daughter just proposed for both of us," Victoria replied, smiling at the absurdity and rightness of the moment. "But yes, David Martinez, I'm proposing to you. I want to marry you. I want to adopt Michael legally. I want to be Emma's stepmother officially. I want us to be a family in every possible way." Emma clapped her hands with delight, and Michael chose that moment to wake up from his stroller nap, looking around with the alert curiosity that suggested he knew something important was happening, even if he couldn't understand what. "Is that a yes?" Victoria asked, still holding David's hand while tourists walked around them on the lake path. "That's absolutely a yes," David said, leaning across the stroller to kiss her properly, while Emma giggled and Michael made appreciative baby sounds. "Can we have the wedding in Switzerland?" Emma asked. "I think Helena would like that. She brought us all together, so she should get to see us become a real family." Victoria felt the truth of Emma's observation settle in her chest like coming home. Helena had spent her final months orchestrating not just Michael's birth, but the creation of the family she'd believed Victoria needed. Having their wedding in Switzerland, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed Emma's healing and their own transformation into parents and partners, felt like honoring Helena's gift while celebrating their chosen future. "We can absolutely have the wedding in Switzerland," Victoria said. "Dr. Hoffman mentioned that the clinic has a beautiful chapel for families who want to mark important moments during their treatment stays. Will Michael be able to walk down the aisle?" Emma asked practically. David laughed, calculating their son's developmental timeline. "He'll be barely 3 months old at the most. He'll probably sleep through the entire ceremony." "Then I'll carry him," Emma decided. "I'll be the big sister and the flower girl and the baby carrier all at the same time." Victoria looked at David, seeing in his expression the same overwhelming gratitude she was feeling. 3 months ago, she'd been a woman who measured success in quarterly profits and competitive advantages. Now she was planning a wedding with an 8-year-old while pushing a baby stroller beside Lake Zurich, and it was the most successful moment of her entire life. "There's one more thing," David said, pulling out his phone to take a picture of their impromptu engagement moment. "I want to call Mrs. Rodriguez, and tell her she's going to be a grandmother to 2 kids instead of just Michael's honorary abuela. And Tony, Victoria added, we should call Tony and let him know that his construction crew is about to get a new sister-in-law who happens to own a construction company. Emma laughed at the thought of their 2 worlds colliding through marriage. This is going to be the best family ever. We have construction workers and business people and doctors and teachers and neighbors who make soup. Michael is going to have so many people who love him. As they walked back toward their apartment, Victoria thought about Helena's final letter and her prediction that learning to love Michael would teach Victoria everything she needed to know about building a family. Helena had been right about everything about Victoria's capacity for love, about David's ability to teach patience and presence, about the way children could create connections that transcended every artificial barrier adults constructed to protect themselves from vulnerability. Michael fell asleep again in his stroller, lulled by the gentle motion and the sound of his family's voices, planning their future together. Emma skipped ahead, her energy returning as the immunotherapy worked its quiet magic, already composing mental lists of wedding details and big sister responsibilities. David and Victoria walked hand in hand, surrounded by Swiss mountains and impossible possibility, understanding finally that some gifts were too precious to be earned. They could only be received with gratitude and protected with love. The new family photo sat where Helena's lonely portrait had once occupied the mantel in the Blackwell family home, a professional image that captured 4 people who'd learned to love each other through circumstances none of them could have imagined. David wore his only suit, the one he'd bought for Emma's school events, while Victoria had chosen a simple blue dress that matched Michael's tiny outfit. Emma stood between them in a yellow sundress, her hair grown back thick and healthy, holding 9-month-old Michael, who was reaching toward the camera with the confident curiosity that had become his signature expression. The photographer had captured something beyond formal family portraiture. There was genuine warmth in their smiles, the relaxed ease of people who'd weathered storms together and emerged stronger. Michael's eyes sparkled with the alert intelligence that suggested he knew exactly how loved he was, while Emma's grin carried the joy of a child who'd learned that families could be built through choice rather than chance. It had been 6 months since their return from Switzerland, 6 months since Emma's doctors had declared her cancer-free, and 6 months since Victoria had officially adopted Michael, while David had gained legal custody that no contract could challenge. Their wedding had taken place in the clinic's chapel, overlooking Lake Zurich, with Dr. Hoffman serving as witness and Emma as maid of honor, flower girl, and baby holder all in one. Michael had indeed slept through most of the ceremony, waking only when Emma's excited giggling became too loud to ignore. The apartment on Maple Street had been expanded through the simple expedient of renting the unit next door, creating a 4-bedroom family space that accommodated Emma's growing independence, Michael's increasing mobility, and the shared life that David and Victoria had built together. Victoria had kept her promise to step back from corporate responsibilities, transitioning Blackwell Industries to new leadership while maintaining involvement in strategic decisions that could be handled remotely. "I never thought I'd be happy working part-time," Victoria confessed to David as they watched Emma teach Michael to stack blocks in their living room. "But it turns out that watching our children grow up is actually more interesting than most board meetings." David smiled, remembering the woman who'd arrived at the hospital 9 months ago, demanding immediate custody transfer. That Victoria had been efficient, controlled, and utterly unprepared for the messy reality of family life. This Victoria could change diapers while helping Emma with homework, could conduct conference calls while rocking Michael to sleep, and could find genuine satisfaction in accomplishments that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Emma's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The Swiss immunotherapy had not only eliminated her cancer, but had left her stronger and more resilient than she'd been before her diagnosis. She'd returned to school with enthusiasm, maintaining her position as an honor student while developing a new interest in medicine that Dr. Peterson encouraged through regular hospital visits, where Emma served as an unofficial junior volunteer. "When I grow up, I want to help other kids who get sick like I did," Emma had announced recently. "But I also want to help families learn how to take care of each other, like we did." Michael was developing into a baby with strong opinions about everything from food preferences to preferred sleeping positions. At 9 months old, he was crawling everywhere, pulling himself up on furniture and demonstrating the kind of determined personality that suggested he'd inherited both David's stubbornness and Helena's strategic thinking. His first word had been "Mama," directed clearly at Victoria during a particularly frustrating attempt to feed him pureed carrots. "He knows exactly who's in charge," David had observed with amusement, as Victoria successfully negotiated Michael's acceptance of vegetables through patient persistence and creative presentation. The Helena Blackwell Foundation had been established with funds from Helena's estate, dedicated to supporting families navigating pediatric cancer treatment. Victoria served as president, David as operations manager, and Emma as the honorary junior advisor, whose insights into the patient experience shaped every program the foundation developed. Their first initiative had been providing travel and accommodation assistance for families seeking experimental treatments abroad, ensuring that financial limitations wouldn't prevent other parents from accessing the same opportunities that had saved Emma's life. "Helena would love knowing that her money is helping other families stay together during medical crises," Victoria said during their monthly foundation board meeting, which took place around their kitchen table while Michael played contentedly in his high chair. Mrs. Rodriguez had officially accepted the title of honorary grandmother, taking over the practical responsibilities that came with loving a family that included 2 working parents and 2 children with demanding schedules. Her apartment had become Michael's second home during Victoria's business calls, and her homemade soup remained the standard treatment for everything from minor illnesses to major disappointments. Tony had promoted David to project manager for Blackwell Industries' construction division, a position that allowed him to oversee building projects while maintaining the flexibility needed for family responsibilities. The irony of working for his wife's company wasn't lost on David, but Tony's practical assessment had been typically direct. "You know construction, she knows business, and together you know how to build things that matter. Makes sense to me." On this particular evening, as autumn settled over their expanded apartment, the family gathered for their nightly ritual of reading Helena's journals together. Victoria had been sharing selected entries with Emma and David, offering glimpses into Helena's thoughts during her final months and her growing excitement about the family she was creating through her elaborate plan. "Listen to this one," Victoria said, settling into the armchair beside Michael's crib, while Emma curled up on David's lap. "It's from 3 weeks before Michael was born." She opened the leather-bound journal to a page marked with a pressed flower from their Swiss trip. "I met with David Martinez again today, ostensibly to discuss final legal details, but really to observe him with Emma. The love between that father and daughter is exactly what I hope to find: fierce, protective, but also gentle and respectful. Emma clearly feels safe to be herself around him, even during her illness. I think Victoria could learn everything she needs to know about parenting just by watching how David cares for his daughter." Emma smiled at hearing herself described in Helena's careful handwriting. She was right about that. Dad taught Victoria how to be a mom by showing her how he takes care of me. "What else does it say?" David asked, though he'd heard most of Helena's journal entries during their evening reading sessions. Victoria continued, "I've been thinking about the family dinners we had as children, before our parents died. Victoria was always trying to organize everything, make sure everyone had what they needed, solve problems before they became crises. She had such a generous heart, but somewhere along the way, she learned to express love through control rather than presence. I hope that caring for Michael will teach her the difference." "Did it work?" Emma asked, though she knew the answer from watching Victoria's transformation over the past months. "What do you think?" Victoria replied, gesturing around their living room, where the evidence of family life was everywhere. Michael's toys scattered across the floor, Emma's art projects covering the refrigerator, David's construction manuals stacked beside parenting books, and the comfortable chaos that came from four people sharing space with genuine affection. Michael chose that moment to demonstrate his newest skill, pulling himself up to standing position beside his crib and bouncing excitedly while babbling something that sounded remarkably like book. His timing was perfect, as if he'd been following the conversation and wanted to contribute his own opinion about family storytelling. "I think he wants to hear more about Helena," Emma observed, moving to support Michael while he practiced his standing balance. Victoria turned to the final entry in Helena's journal, written just days before Michael's birth. "If my plan works, if Victoria learns to love Michael, and David learns to trust Victoria, and Emma accepts them both as family, then my death will have created something beautiful instead of just ending something lonely. I may not live to see Michael grow up, but I'll know that he's surrounded by people who understand that love isn't about having perfect circumstances. It's about choosing to build something meaningful with the people who matter most." David felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with thinking about Helena's sacrifice. She'd given up her final months to orchestrate their meeting, had died believing that her death would serve a greater purpose than her life had achieved. "I wish she could see us now," David said quietly. "Maybe she can," Emma suggested, with the matter-of-fact acceptance of mysteries that characterized her approach to difficult concepts. "Maybe Helena gets to watch Michael grow up and see that her plan worked exactly the way she hoped." Victoria closed the journal and looked around their living room, taking inventory of the life they'd built together. Michael was now sitting contentedly in Emma's lap, chewing on a soft book while she read to him in the patient voice she'd learned from watching her parents. David was folding laundry with the efficient movements of someone who'd mastered domestic multitasking, and the dinner dishes were drying in the rack beside a kitchen window that looked out onto a playground where Michael would someday chase Emma's children. This wasn't the life Victoria had planned during her years of corporate climbing and strategic achievement. It was messier, more unpredictable, and completely dependent on other people's needs and feelings. It was also the most satisfying success she'd ever experienced, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. "You know what I think?" Victoria said, lifting Michael from Emma's lap for his bedtime routine. "I think Helena knew exactly what she was doing when she chose all of us for this family. She knew Emma would teach us about courage, and David would teach us about devotion, and Michael would teach us about hope." "What did you teach us?" Emma asked curiously. Victoria considered the question while settling Michael against her shoulder for his final feeding of the day. "I think I taught you that families can be built through choice and effort, not just genetics and luck. And maybe that love is something you create together, not something you wait to find." As Michael drifted towards sleep in Victoria's arms, and Emma nestled against David's side, and the familiar sounds of their evening routine settled around them like a blessing, Victoria understood that Helena's gift had been even more precious than she'd initially realized. Helena hadn't just given her a child to love, she'd given her the experience of being truly, completely happy, with a life that existed beyond her own ambitions and fears. The family photo on the mantel caught the last light of evening, four faces smiling with the confidence of people who knew they belonged together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Michael's continued development, Emma's school activities, Victoria's business responsibilities, David's construction projects. But tonight, they were simply a family who'd chosen to love each other through every circumstance life could offer. And in the growing darkness outside their windows, Victoria could almost feel Helena's presence, approving of the chaos and joy and ordinary magic they'd created together, exactly as she'd planned.